Hello and welcome to this Year 9 lesson on the Nazis' rise to power. You will lead with you the lesson note template, which you will find has been sent to you, or it might have been posted on Teams, or failing all of that, you will find it in the description at the bottom of this video. So get that out and get ready to go. Okay, let's get started on task 1. We can see here that task 1 is to write down all the reasons why people increasingly voted for the Nazis from 1928 to 1932. This was the focus of the last lesson that you did, so you should have it relatively fresh in your memory. So what you're going to do in a moment is you're going to pause and you are going to write down everything that you can remember about why people increasingly voted for the Nazis 1928 to 32, what type of people voted for the Nazis and why. So, pause it, off you go. Right, hello and welcome back. After that little brief interlude of some revision on your part, you can see on page 3 of your lesson notes template that is on the screen here that there is some information about why the Nazis were increasingly supported by the electorate in the period 1928 to 32, and this information combined with the work that you did in last lesson should help you to fill in any missing gaps. The important thing is that we talked about in last lesson the way in which the Nazis rise to power, or rather the Nazis rise to greater support, because their rise to power is something ever so slightly different that we'll look at in today's lesson. Their increased support is largely due to the Wall Street crash and the economic depression that it brought. That's the circumstance, the economic change, that on the one hand is crucial in explaining why the Nazis got increasing support. On the other hand, the Nazis were able to skillfully exploit and capitalize on the economic depression and the problems that people found in order to promise a better future and to win more votes. It's important to note, however, that even when we get to July of 1932, we're still only talking about the Nazis getting 37% of the vote, which means that 6 out of 10 Germans are not voting for them. So don't think that the Nazis are swept to power by an overwhelming majority of the German population voting for them. That isn't actually true. More people voted for somebody else than for the Nazis. Okay, we're going to use this information that we've just recalled about why the Nazis got increased support between 1928 and 32 to have a look at a how useful question. And first of all, you're going to watch a little clip which is going to jog your memory about how you answer these types of questions.
Sources are. Now, it's important here to realize that even if you think a source is really subjective, even if you think a source is really biased or it's really unreliable, it's still useful. All historical sources are useful. Even if you don't agree with them, even if they're given a one-sided view, they are useful because they show us a certain aspect of the past. So here we have a question that asks you to consider the reasons for the growth in support of the Nazi Party in the years 1929 to 32. Source B is a photograph from a German newspaper. Source C is from Inside the Third Reich by Albert Speer, which is published in 1970. Speer here is remembering hearing a speech made by Hitler in 1931. So when you're considering how useful it is, you need to think about the provenance and the content. So by the provenance we mean the nature, the purpose, the when, the who, the why, what is this source and how does that influence how useful it is, and the content is what it's actually showing us. What's really important is that you must use your own knowledge to set the source in historical context. So you are not looking at how useful the source is in isolation. You are looking at how useful it is based on what you already know. Otherwise, you're not actually doing any history. You're just doing a comprehension exercise or you're doing an inference exercise which anybody could do without having any historical knowledge of the period. So here we could say that because it's from a newspaper, it shows lots of people queuing, it shows how important the Depression was, how unemployment was a real problem for Germany. We can see from the content that there are huge queues of people. We can see how many people are queuing for their unemployment benefit. We also see a poster on the wall that says "Vote Hitler." So it's useful for showing us what was going on at the time. It's useful because the fact that it's in a German newspaper shows us this was a real problem. Our own knowledge of the historical context shows us that lots of people did vote for Hitler because they were unemployed, because they thought he was the last great hope for Germany. However, it's just one photograph. It doesn't really provide any understanding of the wider context. It's just a snapshot of that particular time. Here, the written source, okay, we could say that it's by Albert Speer and he's a Nazi minister and he's looking back and therefore he might be more favourable towards Hitler, but it's still somebody who was there at the time. The content shows us how much enthusiasm there was amongst crowds of people. It also shows us how popular Hitler was because of the fact that he was able to persuade Germany that it could recover from its problems. We know from our own historical knowledge that Hitler was a powerful speaker, he had charisma, the Nazis used propaganda well. So both sources are useful. That's the important thing. You don't have to decide which one is more useful than the other. The question doesn't require you to do that. It just requires you to say what is or is not useful about the sources. And because the exam board has chosen two sources and said how useful, you can assume that there will be some strong elements of utility, things that are useful about both of the sources. So you're not trying to make some sort of comparison, this source is useful, this source is useless.
Okay, so let's move on to task 2, and you're going to have a look at some different sources that are essentially focused on the same issue as the example that you've just looked at. So this says, how useful are these sources, blah, 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 for an inquiry into reasons for increased Nazi support 1928 to 32. So think about what you have just seen in the video clip and consider what the source shows. So we've got Otto Strasser, a Nazi who often opposed Hitler, wrote about his qualities as a speaker. As the spirit moves him, he is promptly transformed into one of the greatest speakers of the century. Adolf Hitler enters a hall, he sniffs the air, for a minute he gropes, feels his way, senses the atmosphere. Suddenly he bursts forth, his words go like an arrow to their target. He touches each private world in the raw, telling each person what they most want to hear. So, what is the source showing us? The source is showing us that Hitler was a talented speaker. The source is showing us that his words were very powerful and they had an impact on their audience, and that he touched people's private world. So, in other words, he told people what they wanted to hear, he connected with them. That is what the source shows us. You're going to have a go at doing some contextual knowledge and some provenance in a moment. If we go on to the next source, same question about how useful for an increased Nazi support. This is from a woman textile worker describing her weekend in 1930. She worked 6 days a week for a very low wage. I would be happy if I could properly provide for my household and children, but of the 25 marks a week, 1.5 marks goes for transport, 6 marks for childcare, and what it otherwise costs to be out of the house all day. Saturdays and every night are spent washing. If I'm finished with the housework on Saturdays around 9:30, I'm usually too tired to give the child a bath, so I have to start up again Sunday morning. Then there are things to mend and everything else that didn't get done during the week. Those are the famous weekend joys of a working woman. I often wonder what I live for and why everything is so unequal. So, what can we say the source shows us? The source shows us that there is a lot of poverty in Germany at this time. The source shows us that work is really hard, that life is difficult. The source shows us that because of the economic depression, because she's writing in 1930, that the financial situation for many Germans was very poor, and there's not enough really to feed the children, keep them warm. It's a very, very difficult existence. So, for both, you should have filled in as we're going along what the source shows. So, just to recap, this source, it shows us that Hitler was a talented speaker. His words were very powerful. He was very charismatic. He was able to touch people in terms of connecting with their daily lives, and he was able to tell them what they most wanted to hear. What the source shows us in a second source is that people had a very difficult economic existence during this time, that work was very hard, that many people struggled to put food on the table, many people found it difficult to look after their children and to survive during the time of the economic depression. What you're going to now do is pause this and think about what contextual knowledge you could use to support the idea that this source is useful, and then think about the provenance of the sources and think about whether that makes them useful or not. So, pause it, off you go. Okay, so what you should really had in here for the contextual knowledge is the information that we know about Hitler as a speaker. We know that he was a very talented speaker. We know that he trained specifically. His training was designed at being the most effective public speaker. We know when it talks about telling each person what they most want to hear, we know the Nazis crafted their message depending on who it was that they were talking to. We know that Hitler used propaganda very carefully in this period to promise people that he would improve the situation. His words go like an arrow to their target. So he spoke to people about what specifically they wanted to hear, and he promised them that he would fix the problems of the economic depression. Now, the provenance is interesting here because Otto Strasser is a Nazi who often opposed Hitler. So Strasser is not Hitler's biggest fan. The fact that he is suggesting how talented a speaker Hitler is makes it a pretty useful piece of information because Strasser was not particularly a fan of Hitler, but he's praising him here, so that makes it particularly useful, and it also corroborates what we already know about Hitler as a good speaker, and we know that Hitler's speaking abilities, his propaganda, and the way in which the Nazis packaged Hitler as the man who was going to fix everything for Germany is one of the main reasons that the Nazis did indeed increase their support between 1928 and 32. We think about this question, or this source, sorry, in relation to the question, the contextual knowledge is that we know that many people were living like this woman. We know that unemployment uh, amongst Germans was very, very high. We know that there was a lot of economic difficulties that people faced, and we know that people felt a sense of despair and unhappiness at this. We know that young people in particular were hard hit with high levels of unemployment and a lack of opportunity. And this is useful to us because it explains, in terms of one particular woman's case, how she was feeling and how she was dealing with these issues. Now, the provenance is also interesting because she is describing what life was like for herself. So this is a very useful insight. She has no reason to lie or exaggerate about the issues. It's a very useful insight into how bad the conditions were. However, the one limitation of this source really is that whilst it provides the context and it supports what we know about the economic depression and the financial crisis and the problems that people faced in Germany in the early 1930s, we are having to infer that this meant that she ended up voting for the Nazis because she was in a difficult position. we don't know if, for the case of this particular woman, the feeling that she had and the situation that she faced was actually going to lead her to vote for the Nazis or not. So there's a slight limitation there in the source. Okay, so this lesson is about the Nazis' rise to power. And we know from the work that we've just done, to recap where we were in last lesson, that the Nazis were increasingly successful at gaining support in the period 1928 to 32, and we've explored some of the reasons why that was, including the economic depression and also Hitler's charisma, power as a speaker, etc., etc. Now, these are obviously the long-term reasons for the Nazis' rise to power. Because if the Nazis don't get increased support in the period 1928 to 32, if more people aren't voting for them, then how do they actually get power in 1933? They can't. Okay, so they cannot get power, and be um, they cannot be in a position to gain power if people don't support them in the first place. So, undoubtedly, the long term reason for Hitler's rise to power is this increased support in the period 1928 to 32. However, and it's pretty important, however, Hitler is not elected as Chancellor. The Nazis never get more than 37% of the vote before Hitler is made Chancellor. Hitler is appointed Chancellor, and he is appointed Chancellor because of the mistakes of others and because of a political miscalculation made by others, in the sense that they think that they can put Hitler in charge and then control him. So the next part of the lesson, we're going to have a look at the reasons why the Nazis were essentially placed into power, why Hitler was appointed as Chancellor. So task 3 asks the question, why was Hitler appointed Chancellor? And we're going to have a look at the political developments of 1932 to answer that question. Essentially, the Weimar Republic was collapsing. Democracy was coming apart at the seams during this period, and Hindenburg, who was the president, was having to call lots and lots of new elections, and he was having to put lots of different people in charge of the Reichstag to try and find a way of bringing some sort of political order, and also to try and find a way of dealing with the economic crisis. So we can see on page 6, and then further down on page 7, there is a lot of information here about why Hitler was appointed Chancellor. And eventually, you are going to create a timeline that shows the key events of 1932 and how they impacted on Hitler and the Nazis. So you're going to read this information, and then you're going to create a timeline. Before you do that, you're going to watch this little clip that's coming up, which will give you some extra information about these developments politically in 1932 and how they had an impact on the Nazis being able to gain power.
So by August of 1932, the Nazis were polling 37% of the vote. They very, very skillfully exploited the economic depression, suggesting that they were the party that would solve unemployment. Hitler was the man who would bring prosperity back to Germany. In August of 1932, Hitler went to Hindenburg and demanded that he be made Chancellor. Hindenburg refused. The Nazis still did not have a majority of the German electorate voting for them. So the final reason why Hitler was able to rise to power lies in the political miscalculations of others. It was Hindenburg and the elite around him who had the final decision about who would become Chancellor. And as 1932 ended and 1933 began, it became clear that those industrialists, those landed gentry, those powerful elite at the head of the German political structure, thought that they could use Hitler as a man who could solve the problems that Germany faced. So in January of 1933, Hitler was finally appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg. He did not win electoral victory, he was appointed by Hindenburg, which means that the political miscalculations of others is the final reason why Hitler was able to become Chancellor in 1933.
Right, so you need now to pause this, you need to use that information on pages 6 and 7 of your lesson note template, read it, think about the overall picture here that other people made the decision about Hitler being appointed Chancellor. So think about those political developments in 1932, plot them on a little timeline, and start to think about how those political developments brought Hitler becoming Chancellor closer to a reality. Okay, welcome back. Here is an example of what a timeline might look like. Now, I by no means expect your timeline to have got as much detail on it as this, but I just want to highlight a couple of important things that your timeline does need to have on. So if we look at May of 1932, that was when Brüning, the so-called Hunger Chancellor, who was very reluctant to do anything to expand the government to help the economic depression, that is when his government fell. So he didn't have a majority, he couldn't get people to work with him. He lost popularity, and so Hindenburg decided that actually the um, I need to give the government to somebody else. So von Papen is made chancellor by Hindenburg. He's a pal of Hindenburg's. And this is even though he's only got 68 supporters in the Reichstag. Sorry, so this is the end of democracy. This is not people voting for their leaders. This is Hindenburg just deciding to put people in charge to try and solve the problem. Von Papen, because he only has 68 supporters, they have to obviously hold election because he hopes he'll get more support. That was in the July of 1932, and Hitler and the Nazis get 37% of the vote, 230 seats. They're the biggest single party. Um, Hitler goes to Hindenburg and says, "Howie Hindenburg, make me chancellor now." Hindenburg's like, "No, I don't really trust you. I don't really want to." So Papen struggles on. He's only got 32 people supporting him in a Reichstag of over 500, so he's not really got much chance of being able to get anything passed by consensus. He just has to use the presidential decree with the support of Hindenburg to get things passed. So he struggles on July, November. They have more elections in November. And this time the Nazis' vote falls a little bit. I think people are a little bit fatigued by elections. People are um, a little bit fed up with constantly going and voting, and people were a bit alarmed at the violence of the SA. Von Papen doesn't do any better. Asks Hindenburg just to close the Reichstag down. Um, Hindenburg takes advice from an army general, von Schleicher, and he says, "You've got to put me in charge." So Hindenburg puts von Schleicher in charge. He lasts for about 2 months because he doesn't have much support either. And that's when von Papen and Hindenburg have a conversation and said, "You know what? Why don't we put Hitler in charge and I'll be his vice chancellor, and that way we can control him." So what we're seeing here in 1932 is not the rise of the Nazis to power as they win a glorious election and have a massive popularity and a huge majority in the Reichstag. What we're actually seeing is that other people make a decision to put Hitler in power because they think it's the best decision to make to try and hold the country together. They put him in power with the idea they're going to be able to control him. So von Papen's going to be his vice chancellor and he's going to calm him down and make sure he doesn't do anything too radical. And so the short-term reason, this is really important, the short-term reason why Hitler is appointed Chancellor in 1933 is the political meltdown that Germany is having in 1932, and it's the miscalculation of other politicians, Hindenburg, von Papen, and others, who think that Hitler's the best guy to put in charge just to try and deal with some of the problems that Germany has in front of it in the short term. So, with that in mind, we now come to task 4 to explain why Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. We've got two columns here. We've got long-term reasons and we've got short-term reasons. And the crucial thing here is that you think about, obviously, in order for Hitler to even be considered a national political figure and a potential leader of Germany, some long-term things have to happen, and those long-term things start with the build-up of Nazi support from 1929 onwards because of the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, and the fallout from that. However, the short-term reason why Hitler is appointed Chancellor is all to do with the political events of 1932, the miscalculations of others, and all the political shenanigans and missteps that are taken during 1932 that we've just talked about. So you're going to pause now, you're going to try and fill in that table as best you can, and you're going to see if you match up your list of long-term and short-term reasons for why Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933 with my list that I'm going to reveal at the end of this lesson. So, off you go. Okay then, here we go. Here's my list in my golden envelope you can see there. So I'm going to color code these as long and short term reasons. So here goes with my long term, and I'm going to put my long term reasons as red. Okay, so Wall Street crash and economic depression, that is red. Skilled propaganda, so the build up and use of propaganda, that's long term. Hitler's charisma and leadership, long term. New techniques of campaign and use of radio, speeches, long term. The role of the SA, long term. Fear of communism, long term. Support and funding from industrialists and big businesses. Now, I'm going to make this purple because I think that's a little bit of what they did long term during the response to the economic depression, but also it was industrialists and big business leaders that were putting pressure on Hindenburg to appoint Hitler in late 1932, early 1933. The failure of other parties, I'm going to have purple as well, because that's both a long-term failure during the Depression, but it's also a failure and a miscalculation by those other political parties during the 1932 political fallout. The division among left-wing groups, again, I'm going to put that as purple because that's a problem in both the long term and the short term. The political miscalculation of conservatives like von Papen, that is undoubtedly a short term, which I'm going to have as blue. The fear of a civil war, so the idea that the violence and the turmoil in 1932 is going to spill over into a civil war, I think that would be a short term. The desire for a strong authoritarian leader is probably both a long term and a short term thing. People wanted that for some time, but the chorus of people who were calling for that strong leader that grew during the period of 1932 and into 33. Mistakes by Hindenburg is undoubtedly a short-term reason, and the failure of the Weimar government to deal with the problems of the economic depression, that is a long-term reason. So we've got both long and short-term reasons are there, and some things that are both. You can check that against your own list. Okay, and so there we have it, the end of the lesson, with Hindenburg sitting, looking a little pensive in the car with Hitler. And I cannot emphasize enough, and at the risk of laboring the point even further than I have already in this lesson, you must understand that Hitler's rise to power, i.e., Hitler being made Chancellor, is down to political miscalculations, political missteps, and political problems of 1932. Hitler was never elected. Hitler was never a man who had a majority of the German electorate voting for him before 1933, and he was not swept into power by a huge national vote in his favour. The reason that Hitler was appointed Chancellor was because there was nobody else that the ruling elite thought that they could call on to try and solve the problems that existed, and they made a miscalculation. Von Papen, who's sitting to Hitler's left on the right of the picture here, he thought that he could control Hitler. He thought that if he was vice chancellor and Hitler was chancellor, that he'd just be able to pull Hitler's strings and work him like a little bit of a puppet. As history has borne out, and as we will find out in our next lesson, it didn't quite work out that way for von Papen, and Hitler and the Nazis moved pretty swiftly to begin to dismantle democracy and erect a dictatorship. So there we have it, people, the end of this lesson on the Nazis' rise to power. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and goodbye.